All right, welcome everyone. Here we are in our next endocrine lecture. Today we're going to be studying the adrenal glands. So, as always, let's go ahead and get started with our not really attendance questions. First, what hormone is released during activation of the SNS, the sympathetic nervous system? And where does this hormone come from? Go ahead and pause your video. Try to answer that. It's going to require you to think back to Bio 137 a little bit. All right, hopefully we've all done that. Let's see what we've got here. What hormone is released during activation of the sympathetic nervous system? We can answer this a couple of ways. We could say adrenaline, but the way that we originally learned it and the more appropriate way is to say epinephrine. That comes from the adrenal glands. We'll look at that in a little bit. And so that answers the where does this hormone come from? We will actually be a little bit more specific when we get to it, but for now we have learned that it comes from the adrenal glands back in Bio 137. So let's take a look at the adrenal glands. We have two of them, adrenal, or some sources you may actually see them called suprarenal glands, but both of those mean the same thing. Ad and supra mean on top of or superior to. So here's a kidney, and the kidneys are located on your back, on the posterior side of your abdomen, right where your floating ribs are. So they're partially protected in back by the floating ribs. And right on the top surface of each kidney is an adrenal gland. And under a microscope, that's what we have here on the right. This is one of the slides that you will be learning in lab. So here is the adrenal gland under a microscope, and here's an artist's rendition of it. But if we look at the adrenal gland under a microscope, we can see some layers, and the layers do look pretty distinct under a microscope. The outermost area is called the capsule, and it's really protective. It does not have an endocrine function. It's a protective connective tissue layer around the outside of the adrenal gland. And then we have these kind of circular structures here. Here we can see them over here also. And then beneath that, we have something that's kind of folded back and forth. We can see that over here also, this kind of folded back and forth area. Going a little bit deeper, we have kind of a darker staining area right here, which we can see over here. And then deeper still, we have an area that we can't really see it too much in this image, but over here we can see it's common to see some big open spaces where blood vessels run through. In our lab manual and in lab, you will see some open spaces in this deepest part right here. Now, the thing about the adrenal gland is what we're seeing here at this deepest point is the middle of the adrenal gland, this area right here where I'm tracing with the pointer. And if we were to continue on, what would happen is we would then go through all of these layers again in reverse. So the deeper you go, you're getting towards the middle, but if you proceed through the middle, then you're going to be going back through again. Now, all of these things have names to them. And the adrenal gland has two main regions, but it's actually like 4 different glands in one. So first, the capsule, I said, does not play an endocrine role, so we will just kind of ignore that. These 3 layers, from the outside in, or from the most superficial to the most deep, we have called the Zona glomerulosa. Glomerular means sphere or bubble, and that's because under the microscope they kind of look like little bubbles. So the zona glomerulosa. Next, Zona fasciculata are these folded back and forth areas. And then on the innermost, we have the zona reticularis. The zona reticularis. All three of those structures together make something called the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex has three layers: zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. And then the innermost area is called the adrenal medulla. So medulla just means middle. So the adrenal medulla is separate from the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex has three layers, and we have the adrenal medulla. So four different things within the adrenal gland, and all of them will behave a little bit differently. The adrenal cortex, there are some similarities between the three layers. The adrenal medulla is kind of doing its own thing. Now let's go ahead and get into what do all of these different regions actually do. Well, collectively, and we're starting with the adrenal cortex, collectively the hormones produced by the adrenal cortex, they are called corticosteroids. Cortico because they come from the cortex, steroids because they are all going to be steroid hormones. And there are three different hormones we'll be talking about, or three different types of hormones. There are glucocorticoids, and this is primarily the hormone cortisol. There's something called mineralocorticoids, and that's primarily the hormone aldosterone. And lastly, there are the gonatocorticoids, and these are the androgens, which are ultimately converted to testosterone and estrogen. So the adrenal cortex produces glucocorticoids, cortisol, mineralocorticoids, aldosterone, and gonatocorticoids, which ultimately become testosterone and estrogen. So what we're going to do is we're going to start layer by layer and go through the different parts of the adrenal cortex, starting with the most superficial, or the outermost layer, the zona glomerulosa. Like I said, it kind of resembles bubbles or circles or spheres under the microscope. And this is where mineralocorticoids come from. This is where aldosterone comes from. So it is a steroid hormone released by the zona glomerulosa. Its stimulus is a hormone called Ang2. Angiotensin 2 is what that stands for. We will talk a lot about that when we get to the cardiovascular system, and again when we get to the urinary system. But just know that Ang2 results from a drop in blood pressure. When blood pressure drops, we have Ang2 circulating in our blood. And Ang2 tells the adrenal cortex, specifically the zona glomerulosa, to release aldosterone. Also, increased blood potassium, ACTH from the pituitary gland, which we will see in another lecture or two. ACTH, also known as adrenocorticotropic hormone, and a decrease in blood sodium. So any of these things, Ang2 resulting from a drop in blood pressure, increased blood potassium, ACTH, and a drop in blood sodium. All of those things tell the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, specifically the zona glomerulosa. So what inhibits aldosterone? Well, an increase in blood volume. So if we have an increase in blood volume, our blood pressure is going to go up. So that's the opposite of what we have right here. Increase in blood volume, increased blood pressure, decreased blood potassium. Any of those things will inhibit aldosterone. Its function, sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. Sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. That leads to an increase in blood volume and an increase in blood pressure. Think about this. At our kidneys, if we take sodium that was going to leave the body in the urine and put it back into the blood, well, what is sodium? Sodium is a solute. If you had me for Bio 137, what do we know about solutes? Solutes suck. That means that they pull water along with them wherever they go. So if we're putting sodium, a solute, back into the blood, what's it going to do? It's going to pull water along with it. And if water is going into the blood, what's going to happen? Blood volume is going to increase. Blood pressure is going to increase. So that raises the question of, well, we're reabsorbing sodium, but we're secreting potassium. That means we're taking potassium out of the blood and putting it into the kidney so that we can urinate it out. We're reabsorbing solutes, but we are also secreting solutes. Why is water going one way as opposed to the other way? Why is water going into our blood instead of into the urine? Well, here's how aldosterone actually works at the kidneys. Aldosterone tells our kidneys to make sodium-potassium pumps. Remember sodium-potassium pumps from Bio 137? They take 3 sodiums and move them in one direction. They take 2 potassiums and move them in the other direction. So what's actually happening? We're moving more solutes, 3 sodiums, into the blood, but we're only moving 2 potassiums into what will eventually become urine. That's why more water is going in the direction of the sodium. Less water is going in the direction of the potassium. So ultimately, blood volume is increasing. Now, what happens if we have too much or not enough aldosterone? Hypersecretion of aldosterone, likely coming from a tumor in the adrenal gland. If you have a tumor in the adrenal gland, one of the things that might happen is you might make too much aldosterone. That's called aldosteronism, or sometimes you will see it called hyperaldosteronism. Well, if you have too much aldosterone, then all of these functions are going to be happening more. What does that lead to? It leads to hypertension. Well, lots of blood volume, lots of blood pressure elevation. Hypertension is high blood pressure. We're likely to get edema. Edema is swelling. Well, swelling comes along with hypertension because fluids are going to be remaining in our tissues, causing swelling. Low potassium, because we're secreting too much potassium. Low potassium causes weakness, could cause paralysis. So aldosteronism or hyperaldosteronism, too much aldosterone. Now, if we have too little aldosterone, we get something called Addison's disease. But Addison's disease is actually hypoaldosterone and hypocortisol. So we're going to cover hyposecretion of aldosterone and cortisol together. We're going to talk about Addison's disease here in just a moment. So now moving deeper into the cortex, we get to the zona fasciculata, the second layer in of the adrenal cortex. And like I said, under a microscope, it seems kind of folded back and forth on itself. Here is where cortisol comes from. Cortisol, remember, is the corticosteroid, so it also is a steroid hormone. Its stimulus is ACTH, that same hormone that we saw a moment ago with aldosterone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Cortisol is inhibited by a negative feedback loop. If you have increased cortisol, cortisol levels rise in the blood, that turns off the release of ACTH, and without ACTH, we do not get the release of cortisol. So what does cortisol do? Cortisol does a lot, actually. So cortisol causes gluconeogenesis. Remember, we saw that with insulin, glucagon, that mechanism there. So gluconeogenesis was when we made glucose from something that was not previously some sort of sugar or starch, so some sort of carbohydrate. That's like taking proteins, fats, things like that, and turning them into a sugar. Increased blood glucose. When cortisol is up, it raises blood glucose, which interestingly, if you've ever had cortisone injections for joint pain or something like that, cortisone is just synthetic cortisol. If you've ever had cortisone injections, you notice you get a lot of energy and you pee a lot. That's because it is increasing your blood glucose. If you've ever happened to take your blood sugar shortly after a cortisone injection, normally that's supposed to be right around 80 to 100. It's not uncommon to see blood glucose up in the 300 or 400s after a cortisone injection. Its function also mobilize fats for metabolism. So your body's wanting a lot of energy in the situations where cortisol is being released. So in addition to increasing blood glucose, we're also going to start breaking down fat. We're going to start to break down protein. All of this in an effort to resist stress. Stress causes ACTH to release, which we will see when we get to the pituitary gland. So stress really ultimately also results in cortisol release. And cortisol is a stress-resisting hormone. It gets you through stressful situations. Decreased inflammation. Well, so now let's back up and look big picture long term. People who are under stress for a really long time. If you've ever seen them, you notice they start to, we can say, man, you look stressed. Well, what is that you're seeing? They start to look kind of haggard. They might look kind of sick. And what's actually happening is, in addition to prepping your body to get through stress, well, that also is going to kind of turn off your immune system. And you get really sick really easy. People who are under stress for a long time are often sick pretty often. So cortisol, there to get you through stress, but it also has a decreased immune activity. What happens when we have hypersecretion of cortisol? Well, something called Cushing's syndrome. But it's actually not so much from the adrenal gland. We can get something causing excess cortisol from the adrenal gland, but more often it's going to come from something going wrong with the pituitary gland causing excess ACTH, which results in excess cortisol. But again, even though we say caused by a pituitary tumor, it could also be something wrong with the adrenal gland itself. And Cushing syndrome, there are things called Cushingoid signs that you get with it. And I don't like how they sound because it sounds like you're making fun of the person, but these are the names of the Cushingoid signs: moon face, buffalo hump, unusual fat distribution, unusual tanning. So let's take a look at what those mean. With Cushing syndrome, moon face, the face is very swollen, it's very, very round. So they call that moon face because it resembles a moon. Buffalo hump, well, with Cushing syndrome, you start to get deposition of fat on the upper part of the back, right between the shoulders below the neck, much like the hump of a buffalo. Unusual fat distribution, so someone with Cushing syndrome oftentimes will have centripetal obesity. And what that means is they are obese, but it's not evenly distributed. Their arms and legs typically are not very large, but the fat is held right around the abdomen. Unusual tanning. So we start to see tanning in places either that is very blotchy or in places that are not exposed to the sun. That is not from cortisol. That is actually from the pituitary tumor side of things, where ACTH comes into play. We will talk about that a little bit more when we get to the pituitary tumor and pituitary gland, but just know that ACTH can cause tanning. We'll see how when we get to the pituitary gland. We also get easy bruising. Wounds heal slowly. That's because of that decreased inflammation. Steroid diabetes. Well, if we have too much cortisol, we're going to have very high blood glucose. Very high blood glucose is going to cause something very similar to diabetes mellitus. It's a different type of diabetes. It is unrelated to insulin, but it results in high blood sugar. If you have high blood sugar, that's going to cause you to urinate a lot. So that's because if there's more glucose in your blood, then more glucose is going to remain or pass through your kidneys during urine formation. And if there's more glucose, glucose is a solute. What do solutes do? Solutes suck, meaning solutes pull water along with them. So glucose in the blood is going to be moved into the kidneys. Water is going to come along with that glucose and ultimately result in more urine than normal. We saw excess urine in diabetes mellitus. Now we see excess urine in steroid diabetes. I wonder if this is going to be a trend. Here in the next lecture or two, we will see more information about diabetes. So keep that in mind, make a note in your margins. Next, hyposecretion. What if we don't have enough cortisol? Well, Addison's disease. So now we're pulling that back. Remember, we just saw Addison's disease, hyposecretion of aldosterone. Now we are seeing Addison's disease is also hyposecretion of cortisol. So what happens with Addison's disease? We get weight loss. We get low blood glucose. Both of those are from cortisol. Low blood sodium, high blood potassium, dehydration, and hypotension. Hypotension is low blood pressure. So those things, the low blood sodium, high blood potassium, dehydration, hypotension, is from the aldosterone side of things. The weight loss and low blood glucose was from the cortisol side of things. How do you treat Addison's disease? With hormone replacement therapy. So synthetic cortisol, synthetic aldosterone basically synthetic steroids. Moving in further still, now we're at the deepest layer of the adrenal cortex. We're at the zona reticularis. Here, under a microscope, it's very faint staining, but with very dark nuclei. This is where we get the androgens, which are ultimately converted to estrogen and testosterone. Collectively, they're known as the gonatocorticoids. Here, this happens in both males and females. This is where estrogen in males comes from. This is where testosterone in females comes from. This is also very important for post-menopausal women because this is where their estrogen comes from once their ovaries stop producing it. So this plays a much bigger role in females than males. So testosterone easily overshadows estrogen. In males, unless the estrogen is being really, really overproduced, then the testosterone overshadows it. So it's uncommon, it's not unheard of, but it's uncommon for males to have any issues here. It doesn't play much of a role. In females, it plays a really big role. So what's the stimulus? Also ACTH. So now, going back through the three layers, we can see the stimulus for aldosterone. There's a few, but we see ACTH. In cortisol, we see ACTH. In the androgens, we see ACTH. So when we get to the pituitary gland in the next lecture or two, remember ACTH, what does it do? It targets the adrenal cortex, AC, adrenocortic. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, the AC, think adrenal cortex. It's inhibited by, well, we don't really know. It's not negative feedback, but we're not real sure what it is that inhibits it. So function, well, in males, like I just said, doesn't play a really big role. The testosterone plays a much bigger role, and really in males, most of the testosterone is coming from the testes. So in females, it drives libido, sex drive. The sex drive in females mostly comes from the zona reticularis. It also influences body hair growth. It's the source of estrogen after menopause. That's the biggie. So what happens if we have hypersecretion of the androgens? Well, in females, it causes masculinization because of the elevated testosterone. It causes virilization. So virilization just means a really high sex drive. Basically, it means it makes you horny. Now, all right, so we have GFR is the way to remember the order. Zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. I used to do this after we talked about the kidneys, but now think when we get to the kidneys, we're going to see this again, GFR. But if you can remember GFR in order, you can also think salt, sugar, sex. G, zona glomerulosa, releases aldosterone, which plays a role with sodium, salt. F, zona fasciculata, releases cortisol, sugar. R, zona reticularis, the sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone, sex. Another instructor used to use the phrase, the deeper you go, the sweeter it gets. So the deeper into the adrenal cortex, well, there you go, salt, then sugar, then sex. But again, I did not come up with that, so kind of disregard that if you want. But remember, the adrenal cortex, it has 3 layers, but it's not the entire adrenal gland. We also have the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, and again, medulla just means middle. This is the core of the adrenal gland. And it is a part of your sympathetic nervous system, if you think back to Bio 137. So here, the adrenal medulla contains things called chromaffin cells, and chromaffin cells are the cells that create and secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Norepinephrine can also be released by some of the neurons in the sympathetic nervous system, but epinephrine strictly comes from the chromaffin cells. Epinephrine and norepinephrine together are adrenaline. So what is the stimulus for the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine? Activation of the sympathetic nervous system. When the sympathetic nervous system is active, neurons that are connected to the adrenal medulla cause the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. What is inhibited? Well, when sympathetic nervous system is turned off and the parasympathetic nervous system is turned on, that causes the stopping of the epinephrine and norepinephrine. So SNS activation causes epinephrine, norepinephrine to be released. SNS deactivation, PNS activation stops the release. What's its function? Well, also sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response. This is kind of weird, but think back to Bio 137 with how the sympathetic nervous system worked. The nervous side, the neural side, when the sympathetic nervous system fight or flight response is activated, we send electrical signals, action potentials, to the body and also to the adrenal gland. The neurons traveling to things like our heart, our lungs, things like that get us ready to fight. We have that very quick activation, but we also stimulate the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands. That has a prolonged effect. Remember the difference between nervous and endocrine. Very quick, short-lived response or slower but long-lived response. The neural side gets our very quick activation of that fight or flight response. But once this epinephrine and norepinephrine are released, we get the long-term fight or flight response. So the stimulus and the function are sympathetic nervous system fight or flight response. Hypersecretion, typically from an adrenal medulla tumor known as a pheochromocytoma. This is a cancer of those chromaffin cells. And if we have a cancer of the chromaffin cells, they are constantly spilling out epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, which basically always keeps you in that fight or flight mode. Constant high blood pressure, constant elevated heart rate, constant feeling of tension, very elevated respiratory rate. All of those things that you think of when you're scared or getting ready to fight, it's just that constantly. So here is how the adrenal gland manages stress. If it's short-term stress, here is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system neural side, releases the adrenaline into the bloodstream, and then here are all those short-term stress responses. But at the same time, if you're under stress, if it's going on for a long time, we get the release of those adrenal cortex hormones, the corticosteroids, to deal with long-term stress. So really, the adrenal gland is our stress response. All right, so that's the end of adrenal gland. We will be talking about this in lab also. This is one of the big topics in the endocrine labs, so make sure to keep this information handy. Keep that chart from lab with you as you work on this, because they really do overlap quite a bit. All right, we've got 2, maybe 3 more lectures left in endocrine, and then we will be done with this chapter. So I will see you next time when we start to talk about the pituitary gland.